Marty Hylton is Historic Preservation for the University of Florida. He oversees the PhD, graduate, and certificate programs and directs the Preservation Institute Nantucket and St. Augustine. He also creates and manages the Envision Heritage Initiative dedicated to exploring how new and emerging technologies can be used to document, conserve, and interpret heritage. Prior to his appointment at the University of Florida in 2008, Marty held the position of Initiatives Manager for the World Monuments Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to conserving endangered heritage sites globally. At the World Monuments Fund, Marty developed and implemented institutional initiatives for the WMF that confronted the challenges of saving specific types of heritage, including modernism at risk, which addressed the distinct obstacles to advocating for and technically preserving modern architecture. Marty is a founding member and president of Gainesville Modern, a trustee of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, where he co-chairs Endangered Sites Committee, and a member of the Friends of Florida Boards of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Marty Hylton.
Thank you, Mary, and I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I think we've got it working. So I have a lot of material. I'm going to move pretty quickly, but I'm going to try to leave some time for questions. So the Preservation Institute Nantucket, if we go to the next slide, the Preservation Institute Nantucket this past summer celebrated its 48th consecutive year in operation. It was, of course, with an asterisk like the rest of the world. We were doing a lot of our work remotely with just a couple of researchers and myself in the field. But over the last 2 or 3 years, many of you may know, we launched a Resilient Nantucket initiative, first funded by the Community Preservation Committee on the island, and then in partnership with the town of Nantucket, we received a coastal zone management grant. So we digitally documented the core of downtown Nantucket and modeled sea level rise and did visualizations that all culminated in keeping history above water in partnership with Nantucket Preservation Trust and others last year. We go to the next slide. At the keynote speaker, Jeff Goodale, last year posed these questions at the end of his talk based on his book, The Water Will Come. And basically the questions were: what will be saved, who makes the decisions, and how is it financed? If we go to the next slide. So those questions sort of drove us as part of the next phase of Resilient Nantucket to look at the South Washington Street area. And we really wanted to explore a kind of new and emerging concept known as regenerative heritage. I think it's another way of saying sort of resilient heritage. But this is a kind of movement that's coming out of Europe and looking at ways of sort of combining sustainability and resilient efforts through the lens of historic places. We go to the next slide. We had a pretty remarkable research team. We divided it into 3 main groups. The natural environment team was led by a colleague here at UF, a landscape architect, Mike Volk, whose specialty is sustainability and landscapes. The built environment or architecture team led by architect Bob Miklos, who's well known on the island, and he has an award-winning firm, Design Lab, based out of Boston. And then I led an urban environment team. We go to the next one, thanks. We had a remarkable group of advisors. I won't name them all, but from the town, Nantucket Conservation Foundation, Linda Loring, Land Bank, many people who made presentations and worked with us rather closely. Next slide, please. And you can keep going. Our goal with the South Washington Street area was to document and assess the cultural landscape and develop a resilience and adaptation, what we called strategy or framework. And to also look at a demonstration project that responds to coastal hazards. Specifically, we were looking at flooding, and even more specifically, we were looking at sea level rise, tidal flooding, and storm surge. We could go on, please. You can see yesterday from the announcement from Remain Nantucket, the 3 study areas that were identified for the challenge. Again, we're focused on what we called South Washington Street and the creeks. Next slide, please. The boundaries, again, the creeks are about 80 plus minus acres. And then with South Washington Street, it was really a union to the water. It was sort of equal amount of developed and undeveloped property in our study area. Next slide. In total, we surveyed about 180 buildings. It was just over 140 acres, close to 4,000 feet of shoreline. We used very simple in terms of the value of the property appraiser's value, minus the town pier and the Great Harbor Yacht Club, which sort of skewed those numbers. You can see the average, it was about 315 million, average price about 2 million per property. You can also see property types. It was sort of an equal amount of distribution from private and recreational governmental, and a number of different property owners, including the town and Great Harbor Yacht Club being two of the largest, and the land bank. Next slide. In terms of resilience and adaptation areas, this was something the town sort of identified as part of their coastal resilience plan. I think we'll hear more about this afternoon, that's getting underway. So there were 12 larger areas that were identified. And so the entire town of Nantucket was identified as one of those areas. And what we were suggesting were sort of sub areas, like the Washington Street area, for example, or Brant Point, as being different from one another. Next slide. And we looked at an amazing amount of policies and guidelines. Thanks to Kim Rose, the Acclimate coordinator, she helped prepare. It was actually our summary of all of the different standards and guidelines and ordinances that impacted our work. It was over 50 pages. So there was a lot. I'm not saying we looked at everything, but we did our best to see how what we were going to propose aligns with current policy. Next slide. And we set up a sort of core principles or values to drive our work. The most important being a sort of holistic cultural landscape and systems approach to inform adaptation and strategic options. Next slide. And we also had to make some assumptions based on, to help sort of frame our work. And a couple of things that I just wanted to bring to your attention is, one is that we weren't going to be looking at any large sort of civil engineering interventions, but rather taking a kind of nature-based approach to adaptation and resilience. And the other assumption was that we weren't really talking about the relocation of the steamship, which is something that is going to be important in terms of impacting how at least vehicular and transportation through the town. So those were two things. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see we did actually look rather closely at how people move through our area. As you're all aware, Washington Street is a core vehicular and transportation route from the steamship to Mid-Island. If we go to the next slide. I think what's interesting, we first looked at the historical development of our area, and as you can see here from the sort of fish lots map, as it's known, in the early development of the town of Sherburne, as it was called at the time, you can see our study area along Washington Street was largely undeveloped, and a large portion of the southern end of that remained the creeks. We go to the next slide. We looked at about 6 different time periods. I mean, these are a bit arbitrary, but it was major milestones or major events, such as the fire in 1846, for example. It kind of ended the whaling era, and then looking at redevelopment after the World War. We go to the next slide. We did a series of trying to understand how the urban pattern changed and when streets appeared. As the area was developed, there was moving from left to right. There was sort of moderate development. Union Street appeared, and that was residential. It remains residential. And there was some industrial related to the waterfront and fishing. It remained that way. The train appears, came through there in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then as you see it kind of today on the right. If we go to the next slide. And with this, we looked really closely at the maps. We were fortunate to have a lot of maps over time, looking at the kind of limits, if you will, or boundaries of where the creeks once existed and where they existed today. So that's what this is looking at. Next. And then we began to map during these, as part of these different periods when buildings began to appear and buildings went away. The one thing I want to say, and we'll kind of go through these quickly, is that there have been a lot of buildings that have been removed over time in this area. And with the exception of maybe Union Street, it's not a cohesive kind of neighborhood based on one period, but it really is layers of different periods of history represented in the built environment. So if we move forward, you can see we can keep going. The gray is representing 1847 and 1917. You can see here this early kind of lithograph or aerial view. It's very sparse development, mostly along Union Street, and some clusters there around what would become Meter and Francis. If you keep going. Next slide. Then we were also fortunate to have a lot of historic photographs. Again, you can see buildings. There's a series of fishermen shanties along the water, late 19th, early 20th century. You can see the train going through. Washington Street is essentially where the train was, and it continues on. The train bed is still used as a bicycle walking path through the creeks. If we keep going, next slide. And now we're in 1918 to sort of 55. You can see there in green, there's development occurring more on the southern end as the creeks begin to disappear and that area is developed where kind of Great Harbor is today. If you keep going. And you can see there the kind of white sandy area on the northern edge of the creeks there. You can see that was a place for sort of boat repair, if you will. That's what will become the Great Harbor Yacht Club. That area was built up and filled in. You can see the creeks are extending kind of to the west of that. If you keep going. And this is kind of an iconic view looking from Commercial Wharf back at our study area. Next slide. And you can see there on the left in this image, the bulkhead, just kind of strategies, and there's one in our immediate foreground too, there at that dry dock for boats. This was a sort of strategy for the development of the area. Next slide. And now we're in 56 to 75, and it's here where the parking lot, the municipal parking lot appears. We keep going. And just an aerial view there, you can see there's more development occurring. Next slide. And then 76 to 86, the town pier is constructed. And then if we could keep going there. And then lastly, I wanted to say this was a photo about 40 years apart of Union Street, and just to say that Union Street has not significantly been altered in terms of its historic character. Next slide. So again, summary of development, you can see the division. Majority of with the exception of that kind of orange and dark gray, which is up to 1917, the majority of development is 20th century, and a lot of that occurred after World War II. So it's basically what we found last year with our work throughout the town, that a lot of our built environment is post-World War II. Next slide. We of course looked at current zoning and the changes in zoning over time. Next slide. And then just to quickly talk about the cultural landscape, we really felt, thanks to Lisa Craig, who'll be speaking this morning, I know we've done a lot of collaboration with Lisa, and she was really promoting this idea of looking at resiliency of historic places through the lens of cultural landscape. So the long and short is that it's basically a balanced kind of view of looking at both the built and natural environment, as well as the tangible and intangible aspects of a historic coastal community. Next slide. This is just the kind of assessment that we undertook. A big shout out in terms of plant inventory, because it's not my area of expertise, but we worked really closely with our natural environment advisors to do that. Next slide. And so we developed a statement of significance, and we looked at the 7 aspects of integrity as defined by the National Park Service. We do feel the area, like a lot of Nantucket, sort of represents that transition from natural environment to a whaling and fishing community to a destination for seasonal residents and visitors. Next slide. And we also, in terms of any sort of interventions that happen on Nantucket, it is a National Historic Landmark. Depending on the funding, district, I should say, depending on the funding that is being used, we'll have to go through what's called a Section 106 review process. And so the standards established federally, we're looking at rehabilitation, which allows for making changes in use and also adaptation of buildings and places. Next slide. And interestingly enough, in terms of the cultural landscape, a significant aspect of this area is tied to what we call the artist colony. If you keep going, the next slide. We kind of looked at the different eras. Again, next slide. And you can see all of these paintings are actually done within the study area. It was a popular spot for those waterfront artists as they became known. If you keep going. We mapped actually the sites that are still existing that are associated with that period. So there's a substantial amount of kind of visual arts and cultural sites that remain in the study area. Next slide, please. We also did we tested a visual preference survey. We had a fairly nice response, nearly 30 people. And if you go to the next slide, what we really were looking for were what are the aspects of the area that people felt were the most significant, if you will. And you can see here the creeks, the town pier, Union Street, and the Goose Pond and Washington Street kind of were always in the top 5. If we keep going. And so we identified these key view sheds, again, based on the response from the visual preference survey. Next slide. And we just identified the idea of kind of guiding concepts, this idea of connection to land, connection to art, and connection to water. Next slide. So really quickly, we'll go through built environment. We use an app, a GIS based app on our phones to collect data, and you can see some of the survey categories. A lot of different data was gathered on the 180 properties, or buildings, I should say. We looked at building use. If you go to the next slide, majority of it's residential, but again, it's a mix. We looked at building styles, again, usually associated with specific moments in time or periods. If you go to the next slide. We also looked really closely at structural systems and foundations. If you're going to talk about adaptation measures, this is really important. Next slide. And then also building condition, very simple, kind of good, fair, poor. But again, if you're going to be talking about making these structures more resilient, their condition is going to be an important aspect of what's possible. We keep going, next slide. Then we also, if we're just go by street, go to the next slide, we looked at each street and the character of the 2 main streets, Union and Washington, Union being colonial era, but also late 19th, early 20th century. Coffin Street was one of the cross streets in the area. It's a really mixed, so is Fayette, a couple of historic buildings, a little more recent buildings. If we keep going to the next slide. Same with Meter Street. It's a lot of these kind of summer cottages. And then Francis Street also has a kind of mix from the NISDA cottages to sort of other summer cottages or residences. And then lastly, Washington Street, which again is a fairly diverse in terms of the built environment. We keep going. The natural environment, similar survey methodology. If we go to the next slide, we identified a number of different landscape typologies, if you will. If we keep going. Again, we did a plant inventory, not exhaustive. I think the takeaway here, there were about 110 species, but it's a very diverse, a lot of diversity in the natural environment in this area. If we keep going. We looked at saltwater marshes, specifically the creeks being our largest natural environment typology, if we keep going. We also looked historically. You can see there's a kind of line that divides the creeks. That's the original historic train bed that's now the bicycle and pedestrian route, and it kind of divides the creeks down the middle. There is a culvert, and I know there's a project being proposed to put in another culvert to change the existing one, but it sort of divides it from saltwater to freshwater. There was also a project in the 1930s to abate mosquitoes that did a lot of trenches that were introduced there, which longer term have done some damage. If we go to the next slide. There's at least one freshwater marsh that occurs along Coffin Street on the opposite side of the harbor shoreline. To be honest, I thought before we began to really look at the maps that this had been there for quite a while, but it looks like, at least my theory is that this may have begun to develop or occurred after the 1991 no-name storm. If we keep going. There's the Goose Pond, I think that everyone knows. Next slide. A number of different types of beaches, including estuary, if we keep going. And of course, there's a public parks, one or at least two operated by the town of Nantucket, but the majority of them are the land bank, which land bank has had a strategy of purchasing buildings and removing them to open up that shoreline and the view of the harbor there along Washington. There's a new park that's being introduced and the widening of the road from Washington to Francis Street there at the NISDA Harbor View Cottages. Next slide. And then we looked at, these are images mostly along Union Street, but there are a lot of sort of gardens, if you will, and backyard plantings. So in terms of vulnerability assessment, if we go forward, again, we looked at, this image is from, looking from down Francis Street toward the harbor. My back in this case, behind me would be the Lightship Basket Museum. So you can see if this is the January 4th, 2018 storm with nearly 4 foot of storm surge. It was a little under. This would sort of indicate that it was over 4 foot of storm surge, but I think this is what we're seeing here too, is both wind driven and wave action. So you can see, I guess the point here is that the area is very vulnerable. We keep going, next slide. Again, we looked at tidal flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the sea level rise scenarios today. This is a FEMA map. Keep going, next slide. Thanks to Chuck Larson. This is a slide that information he provided looking at tidal flooding on Nantucket. We're fortunate to have a tidal gauge. It's been in place since the early 60s there in the harbor, maintained by NOAA. Next slide. And you can see of the 10 worst flooding events on record in Nantucket, 7 since 2013. The 2018 storm being the second worst on record. And you can see here, just with I'm going to zoom in on the developed area of our study area, but what I want to show here, and the projections that we use for sea level rise were the NOAA intermediate high, which is what we use to do the modeling and visualizations during the first phase of Resilient Nantucket. And what you're seeing here is the kind of expansion of the creeks over time from 2030, 2060 to 2100. Next slide. So at 2030 sea level rise, you've got the coastline there along Washington Street being impacted. And to the bottom of the screen, towards the creeks and to the Great Harbor Yacht Club, I want you to sort of pay attention to what's going to happen in that area as we go through time. If you do the next slide. So with 2060, you can see the creeks are expanding around Great Harbor. It's almost becoming an island or a peninsula. That's because historically it was built up over time with the dry dock sort of boat yard. You can see water's moving into the middle of the study area. We chose 2060 because we looked really closely at the data And it's somewhere between 2050 and 2060 is what we feel is the real tipping point where a large amount of the study area becomes inundated. And it's between 2050 and 2060, at least at this intermediate high projections, that Washington Street is then completely underwater. Next slide. And then by 2100, you have water up to Union Street. There's that kind of distinct elevation change there, a cliff, if you will, between Union and Orange. But what I want, my caveat here with this two-dimensional map is that you've got water at Union, but it doesn't necessarily mean that water's in the first floor of houses. You may have water in basements or foundations, but it's not quite to the level where it's inundating first floors at this moment. Next slide. And then if you just go to the next slide, this was just our visualizations. You can go through these quickly, Rita, of you just hit one after the other. This was our modeling. You can see here at 2080, about 6 feet, you've got water all the way to Union Street. And then these are just some elevations that we looked at, the kind of cross streets in our study area. Next slide. So in terms of resilience, we looked at, obviously, there's 3 broad categories of protect, accommodate, or retreat. If we go to the next slide. Protection could be things like those hard barriers or civil engineering projects. On the top is the MOSE project in Venice, the gates that are activated when there's storm surge coming from the Adriatic into the lagoon. And then we heard from Aaron Minigan from Charleston that they're proposing up to a 12-foot seawall. These are renderings of what that might look like. Next slide. We're seeing protection projects already on Nantucket. This is the stabilization project at in Sconset. Next slide. And in terms of accommodate, when it comes to the built environment, there are 3 sort of broad categories of dry flood proofing, trying to keep the water out, wet flood proofing, which is allowing water to access the building, but doing it in a way where the building can be recovered more quickly, and then of course elevating, and that's already occurring in the study area. This is one of the older structures along Washington Street that was elevated about 4 years ago. It's a little over 4 feet off the ground. There was also an addition done, but this is happening. It's just happening more on a property by property, more myopic kind of way. Next slide. And then this is a proposal for 92 Washington Street, which has been approved, and they're using that 9-foot kind of FEMA recommended elevation. This property is right next door to the Great Harbor Yacht Club. So it's just a way of saying that this is already happening, that changes are being made that's going to impact the character of the individual areas or neighborhoods of Nantucket. And I think we really felt strongly that we should be looking at this in a neighborhood scale and having sort of guidelines for elevating and wet proofing. Next slide. And then there's retreat. We've already seen the relocation of the Sankaty Lighthouse, moving it, and we, of course, had a famous case of a rather large residence last summer that was moved back from the coast. Next slide. Thanks to Bob Miklos, our partner in this effort, he kind of came up with this idea of the linear system. So what you're looking at here is as water begins to move into the area, we're talking about kind of a different treatment for each of these linear systems. The first is the idea of introducing a living shoreline. And right now it's just conceptual. That can mean many different things. I'll come back to that. How we might modify the existing harbor shoreline, including berms and different types of plantings and drainage. Then we've got Washington to Union Street and looking at what can be done with the buildings again, and also controlling water. And then lastly, we have the Union Street linear system. Next slide. And we'll move in, if you go on to the next slide, to the linear system strategy. We'll zoom in. So the idea here is that, again, living shoreline, adapting existing shoreline. A lot of the property is owned by the land bank in the town, so there's some opportunities there. And then we are proposing a concept called opportunity adaptation opportunity zones. So you have an area where it's the town parking lot, the finance building, a town-owned park, you have the existing wetland that's protected, and Mariah Mitchell property. We worked with Mariah Mitchell on this. So the idea that there's kind of a contiguous series of properties that could be looked at holistically rather than property by property. We go to the next slide. And then when we get to 2060 in the linear systems, we go to the next slide, we'll zoom in. You can see the adaptation opportunity zone is extended to include the town pier, and the idea that trying to work to keep the pier in place. And then we're also proposing a second adaptation opportunity zone that could happen with one of the larger property owners in the area, the Great Harbor Yacht Club. We had a very kind of preliminary meeting with them, but I think the idea is maybe to encourage the yacht club to be a kind of model for how their properties might be adapted and how others in the area may be adapted. We go on to the next slide. And if we look closely, we can keep going, Rita. We looked at, in November of this year, the Park Service issued their flood adaptation for historic building guidelines, and we rather followed those pretty closely, but now are in the process of really adapting them to the specific needs of Nantucket. If you go to the next slide. So interesting enough, what we're proposing is rather than just strictly looking at one strategy, it's a combination of strategies where it would be elevating and maybe wet proofing. Right now, the town, in terms of its hazard mitigation plan, is not really recommending the wet proofing of private properties, but we think this is something that might need to be revisited. Next slide. And of course, elevating. We go forward. Next slide. Yeah. And then we chose two properties, one in the third linear zone between Washington and Union. It's 1 Fayette Street. If we go to the next slide, what can be done in the next 10 years, 2030. So we're talking about things like looking more closely at the foundation and its the idea of raising and concealing utilities, retaining and adding new vents that allow water to move under the building more easily during flood events, the idea of modifying landscape for rain gardens and permeable surfaces that allow water to drain. If we keep going to the next slide, those are more wet proofing, but by 2060 in this linear zone, we're talking about elevating the structure, and we're now really focused on, we're still continuing this work, what the details of that might look like and what the foundation should look like and how to mitigate that kind of pretty marked change in the built environment. If we go to the next slide. And then 30 Union we took a look at. We can go to the next slide. This is the last linear zone to be inundated with sea level rise. So again, longer time frame here, we're talking about more like 40 years to introduce some of those same ideas of venting and changes to landscape. If we go though to the next slide, we then would be looking at elevating this property as well. If we keep going, Rita. If we just go to the next slide, please. And the other thing that we put out there is the idea of a uniform height, where as buildings are raised or as property owners make that decision or new buildings are constructed, that there's a uniform first floor height. So again, rather than each property sort of building off of the ground sort of 9 feet, the idea that the first floors would all be sort of in alignment. So toward Union Street at Francis, you would have buildings being raised not as high off the ground. It may be something more like 3 feet, where as you move toward the water, you are talking about buildings being as high as 8 feet off the ground. If we just go through the next few slides, Rita, just to show, this is a concept, again, we're still finalizing the idea here. And then the natural environment adaptation, we looked at a number of Number of strategies. One is the creeks in terms of restoration. I think the big takeaway here was the idea of maybe removing the train bed that serves as the bicycle route and pedestrian path, and maybe installing a kind of bridge that lightly touches the creeks but allows for kind of migration and movement of the salt marsh underneath it rather than retaining it like a dam. If we go to the next slide. The idea of a shoreline there along the harbor, which could include oyster beds. We go to the next slide. Again, some modifications along the existing shoreline, including berms and indigenous sort of plantings and other ways of assisting with stormwater management. Next slide. And then maybe with the public parks, that the idea of sort of rain gardens or using the parks as a way of helping control water during flooding events. Next slide. And then the idea this area had a strong visual arts history, and the idea of continuing kind of public arts. The Acclimate brand, we put that out there as an Acclimate art initiative. This is an example of a light installation that shows water levels as it moves into an area along the coast. If we go to the next slide. And some simpler ways to engage the community in this effort. Next slide. If you just keep going from the public art, thank you. So with the adaptation opportunity zones, we looked specifically at opportunity zone A, if we keep going, and then more specifically at 33 Washington Street, which is owned by the Mariah Mitchell Association. That property there now, which was the Kerr Art Studio, an early 20th century building, the yard there floods pretty regularly. If we go to the yard along Washington, if we go to the next slide. So working, it was Bob Miklos and his firm Design Lab that worked with Mariah Mitchell to look at a couple of concepts. This was a year or so ago, of the kind of development of that property as a, to give them sort of public presence downtown, and the aquarium will be going away. So the idea of being able to do the aquarium and programming there along 33 Washington. Next slide. So that's where it is on the map, and you can see the Mariah Mitchell Aquarium where it's at now. That property is owned by the land bank. So again, the aquarium will be going away in the future. The next slide. And if you can see with the green that's there, these are properties that's owned by the land bank, the town of Mariah Mitchell. So if we don't look at them just by property boundary, begin to look at them as a contiguous, I think there's a lot of opportunity here, we thought, to begin to implement a kind of pilot effort for resiliency. Next slide. And some of the precedents for the ideas of rain gardens. We go to the next slide. So what Bob and his team working with the students developed was the idea of a rain garden that would eventually be a freshwater then saltwater marsh in the front yard of the 33 Washington Street property, with a series of platforms that would allow for kind of interpretation and programming. One of the art studio buildings that's behind the main building would be also relocated toward the street to serve as a kind of entry point for visitors. Next slide. And then eventually the entire site would be developed out as that sort of Mariah Mitchell campus. And all of these buildings would be elevated to accommodate sea level rise and storm surge. Next slide. And if you just go to the next one, you'll see a visualization. That's the front yard of what that might look like, with the studio building, the historic building in the foreground, and an elevated platform off of Washington Street there in the background. In the center of that, again, being a rain garden that would eventually be a freshwater marsh. Next slide. This is the view from there to the harbor. This is what it would look like with the yard reimagined as the rain garden and that series of platforms for both programming and also interpreting resilience. And then coming back, the idea of the parking lot there, you can see we could also have permeable surface installed, and also the idea of the park that's there owned by the town, and also areas of that parking lot also becoming kind of green areas that would assist with storm drainage and water management. Next slide. And ultimately, and we're not talking about in the next 10 years, but maybe by 2060, the idea, because the parking lot will be going away as the area is slowly inundated with water. So the idea that it could be a kind of what we call cultural and workforce village that could be constructed there in the parking lot. So we really were trying to look at this as not only a doomsday scenario, but that there may be opportunities for different types of development, that you're not abandoning this area. We weren't talking about managed retreat, but we were talking about managed change. You go to the next slide. And this was just some inspiration of that we looked at the Marlborough School in Vermont and the Deer Island Art School in Maine as what those kind of structures might look like, but again, evoking the historic architecture of Nantucket. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, some of our recommendations were the idea of sub-areas for resilience and adaptation among the 12 that the town had identified. This linear systems approach, which we think could work well. The idea of the adaptation opportunity zones and how would you fund projects within those areas. The adaptation of buildings, combining both elevating and wet proofing rather than one or the other. This idea of a uniform design flood elevation, where the first floors of all buildings would align as they're elevated or when and if they're elevated. The adaptations of landscapes, there's a lot of opportunity here because you have a few major property owners, including town government, but then also how we begin to encourage private property owners to kind of change their thinking about what their landscaping may be in their backyards along Union, and introducing concepts like rain gardens. The public art program or Acclimate, and then the demonstration project at Washington Street, Mariah Mitchell, which could be done in phases. Next slide. And for next year, I think we've decided to return to this area and do a street by street study. So we started last year, 2019, looking, and really 2018, 2019, looking at the entire town. And we've gone down to the neighborhood or sort of community scale. And now we're going to look street by street and make very specific recommendations. Union and Washington, very different characters. And so is Coffin, Meter, Fayette, and Francis. So we're going to return and kind of add that whole nother layer of information to this area. Next step, next slide, Ryder. And I just wanted to say, coming up on the 50th year of Penn, it's kind of come full circle. What you're seeing on the slide was an early study in 1969 where the Preservation Institute in Nantucket wasn't just looking at individual buildings, but entire streetscapes and neighborhoods in Nantucket. And so I think we're kind of returning to that kind of urban scale approach, cultural landscape approach. We go to the next slide. And then I just wanted to end by saying, I think that Nantucket is an incredibly innovative and creative place and has been resilient for hundreds of years. The residents and visitors in Nantucket have been living with water and natural events like hurricanes and nor'easters. And so seeing the Dreamland floated, I think it was floated twice actually across the harbor. I think that, together we're going to find a way to move forward. And then I think that's going to conclude my talk.
Great. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I think I kept it pretty quiet.
No, that was fantastic. I think it's really powerful to see that measured drawing compared to the laser scan of Orange Street. And for folks who don't know, MPT's offices are at 11 Center Street here. We're in the building that's owned by the University of Florida. We see the University of Florida as great partners, and they're kind of the ones who said, hey, turned us on to really looking at what arises in historic preservation concerns. So we're so grateful to be here continuing this conversation. Okay, question.
Can I say, Mary, we can get it out to people, but the recording of what I did was in about 40 minutes, was an hour-and-a-half presentation in August, and that's been recorded. It's online if people are interested.
Okay, great. Yeah, Betsy Grubbs is asking if there's a link. Kim, do you have maybe a link that you can post to that so we could see the slides? Jillian asking, would Washington Street be elevated or traffic rerouted? And Tom O'Shea, who we just heard from, commented that the trustees are in the design phase for raising a public road to Crane Beach and Ipswich by 2.5 feet for 50 more years of access. So a question about the road.
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, I'm not a civil or transportation engineer. We didn't really have that as part of our expertise this summer. So we made an assumption that the road there will not be raised. I think, but I will say this about the raising of the road in that area. I think the big question is, because it comes through town, right? So at what point are you going to raise the road all the way through town? That means that the intersection of Main Street and Washington is then 2 foot above ground. So I think there's a question about if you were going to raise it, where you would raise it. And then I think there's bigger questions again about, is it going to just, is it actually going to afford some protection for the historic and non-historic houses on the opposite side of the harbor? Or is it going to also basically be a berm that's going to cause other kind of issues with water management? So I personally think at this point, alternative transportation routes have to be considered. That has to be on the table.
There's a question about the types of building materials, for example, foundation materials, mortar, lumber, paint, and sealants. What is best dealing with both freshwater rainfall and saltwater flooding due to sea level rise and storm surges?
Specifically, paint and sealants? Is that?
They're just building materials. Right? Are there building materials that are better suited to dealing with freshwater and saltwater than others? I think the National Trust was looking at. Did they talk about that?
I'm sorry, Mary?
I said, I think that the National Trust was looking into that and had mentioned that, or excuse me, the National Park Service had mentioned that in St. Augustine, the work that.
So there are guidelines that can be found online. I can share that link as well. The how to adapt historic buildings to flooding is those kind of recommendations the National Park Service were issued in November. It didn't really get down to the sort of material level of paint finishes. I think the issue is, if you're talking about dry proofing or trying to keep water out of a masonry system, the problem is a lot of the brick foundations that we have, historic brick foundations like along Union Street, those have to breathe, right? You're only going to trap water in them and cause more damage in the long term. So I think that that's at the stage where we're at right now, is really looking at, and what they've done in Charleston, for example, what Aaron talked about yesterday was making the decision to kind of mimic the historic, but does that mean it's concrete with the brick veneer rather than brick load bearing? I think these are some of the, I don't think it's going to happen at the finishes level where you're going to be talking about water. I think these are larger kind of structural engineering interventions.
What I was remembering. NPS's testimony is referred to as archaic material, historic old growth wood and brick for constant inundation and impacts, versus the new materials produced as waterproof. Interesting.
So the National Park Service is doing a series of tests where they built kind of simulated sections through different types of historic buildings with like a brick foundation, for example, and timber framing and traditional plaster. I think when we are talking about wet proofing, I think that's one of the things that our team grappled with and continues to, if you're allowing the first floor of a building to flood and it has its original finishes, how do you approach that? You know, do you allow a change in finish? You're talking about historic wood floors or traditional plaster. I will say from my work in New Orleans and Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina, the buildings that retained their historic fabric were much easily recovered more quickly than those who had modern materials, because a lot of the wood that was used in New Orleans was came from the cypress. When New Orleans, the swamps were drained, it's naturally rot resistant and insect resistant. The 3-coat traditional plaster, which we have a lot of on Nantucket, mold doesn't grow on lime. It does on sheetrock because it's paper. So there's a real long-term cost benefit, not only preservation benefit, but I think that being able to recover historic properties more quickly. And we saw the same thing in St. Augustine after Hurricane Michael in 2016. I did some work over there as well. So.
Another reason to retain the historic fabric of your home. Well, we're just about out of time, but I think folks are definitely interested in that link. So we will include the follow-up with the recording of all these presentations, the links from that the presenters might have mentioned from their other projects. And there's certainly a lot to watch. This is the first year that PIN was online this year. And I know we missed having the students up here, but the University of Florida for 50 years, which many people, I think people are realizing that more now, but
it's the oldest continually operating program of its kind in the country. So October 7th, 2022 is the big celebration on the island that weekend. We've already set the date and are working towards, so we can provide more information, but I will provide the link to the recording from the final presentation. If you want me to share this presentation, you've got it, Mary. It's fine to share it. But the final report won't be issued until after the first of the year.
well, thank you, Marty.
Thank you.